Okay, war and empire in 18th century England. And war. That's the problem. It's supposed to be coming out through these speakers, but it's not. We'll just forget about that for now, okay? For most of the 18th century, though, the country was at war. So this is the first important thing that we need to look at, and that's why I've chosen it for the first lesson. It was a century, basically, of war. And if you're quick, you might get some of them in, okay? 1701 to 14, all right, there's the war with Spain. Then there's rebellion in Scotland immediately after that, 15 to 16. 18 to 20, more war with Spain. Almost 20 years of relative peace after that. The next major war is 1739 to 42, war with Spain again. And then in 40 and 48 to 48, France and Germany also. Another rebellion in Scotland in 1745. All of Europe is at war from 56 to 63. War in India in the 1760s. And there's the American War of Independence, more war in India, more war with France, more war with Spain, war with Holland, war with the United States of America, war in India again, the French Revolution War, and rebellion in Ireland. There's a huge amount of stuff going on there. That's just the big ones. I don't know if you want to see them again. But that's taking you through the major wars. They're actually yeah. Okay, these are just the big ones. There are several other smaller wars that are going on, or conflicts of various kinds. Basically, we're talking about a period when Britain is fighting with almost everybody. Okay? And part of what we want to do today is understand why. What were they fighting for? What was it all about? Okay? It's a very different kind of conflict, for example, from World War II, which was the last time that a lot of the world was in big conflict. So we need to try and understand it in its own historical context. So let's take a look then at that. All right. So moving on then. As I say, those are just the big ones. There are plenty of other smaller conflicts going on all through the century as well. So, what was it all about? Some of it was for control of land, control of territory, especially because new parts of the world were being opened up through exploration, improved transport. For example, the ships were now able to go across the Atlantic Ocean. Since 1492, Columbus had discovered America, and there'd been a big fight among European countries to grab land across the Americas. And so part of it was about land, but even more than the land is the markets that came from that land. The shokuminshi, the colonies, would provide goods. And to a large extent, the fighting was to have control of the markets for those goods. So that you've got sugar, tea, cotton, tobacco, spices. Okay, sugar. Well, you know what sugar is. There it is, in case you didn't know. Tea, cotton, tobacco, spices. These were the kinds of products that Europe was prepared to go to war for. It was fighting, countries were fighting with their own neighbours in order to have access to these goods. They wanted to be the people who sold those goods to other European countries. They wanted to be in control of the market, selling those goods. And so they would fight wars to control the areas where those goods were being produced, basically. There were some other reasons for fighting, but that was the major one. Now, if we just look at this, England, at the end of the 15th century, was a small country. Take a look at it. Just one little country in a big world. The map shows you England together with Wales and a part of Ireland. So not even the whole of the British Isles, not even that was all, you know, in one country. It was divided. All right, this area here, they were separate, independent countries. Okay. So that's the situation, okay, in 1492, in the year that Columbus is discovering America. It's just a small, unimportant country tucked up there off the coast of Europe. But by 1660, things had changed quite a bit. This little country now had colonies. 150 years later, it had colonies in Africa, India, and the Americas, and it also basically had control of the entire islands. So the areas that were grey before are now red. All of Ireland, all of Scotland. They're all not formally united, but they're all basically under the control of England. And then you've got these colonies thousands of miles away, all right? Thousands of miles away, okay? It's not like Napoleon or Hitler who were fighting for control inside Europe, to control different European countries. No, they're fighting different European countries to control places that are thousands of miles away. Okay? If we move on into the into the 18th century, you'll see not a very big change. You're going to have to look very carefully to see the red bits get a bit bigger. Okay, so that's 1660. If you look carefully, okay, they're getting a little bit bigger. All right, I'll try that again. In terms of size, it doesn't seem like too much, but in terms of power, it's a big, big difference, because the infrastructure, it's not just that the size, these places, when they first went, there were just a few wooden houses, okay, and people growing, you know, bread or something simple. By the middle of the 18th century, these places had their own big cities. Okay, these places had developed infrastructure, roads and transport, and big ships were coming in and going out all the time. Back in the 17th century, if you went to live in one of those shokuminshi, you might not see another person, you know, outside your community for like maybe once a year or something like that. Okay, ships would come toki-toki, occasionally. But by this time, ships are coming frequently. They're busy, active, well-developed places. So although the amount of land doesn't look much different, the difference in terms of power was very big. So that's the situation in the middle of the 17th century, and Britain now seems unstoppable. It's got control of its European rivals. It's controlling an empire. If you look at it again, this is 1660, and just slightly growing those red areas up to the middle of the 18th century. Okay? All right, and then in the early 20th century, wow, okay, half the planet seems to be covered by all that red ink showing the British Empire. So our century is really important. The 18th century that we're looking at now is really important because that's when Britain really started down the road in that direction. That's when Britain really put itself on the map. Okay? And of course, if you look at it today, whoops, that's all gone, more or less. And it's almost like we're back to where we started. Look, not even all of the grey parts of its own islands. Look at Minami Ayururando, okay, Southern Ireland. That's not British anymore. Okay, so and a few years ago there was a referendum about Scotland. Tokuritsu ni naru kadoka, giri naranakatta. But it's possible that it will go back to being a small country that doesn't even cover the whole island. Well, it still doesn't. Even now, it doesn't cover Southern Ireland. It may lose Scotland. Okay, they seem to want to get out of Europe. So, korekara mite miyo. But, chotto matte, it's not quite. Just like you do understand, 18世紀の関係ではないけど, this is 現代のイギリス. It might seem that we've gone back to where we started, but there are still some traces of the British Empire. Okay, can you see them? All of these are little island possessions that the British own. They're still part of but they're the kind of what's left of the British Empire. And it's interesting that most of them are small islands, because that's what made the British Empire in the 18th century. Not the big red bits that you could see, but the little islands meant that British ships could stop anywhere and get fresh fruit, fresh vegetables. British ships could stop all over the world because all these little islands, takusan no chisana shima, they all belonged, or many of them belonged to Britain. So that was one reason why its empire was so strong. Okay, one of the very famous songs about the British Empire says, "Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves." It's the control of the sea that makes the British Empire, that made the British Empire so strong, and it still controls a number of strategically placed islands around the world. And for Japanese people, I think it's important to point out that there is also something called the Commonwealth of Nations, which is a group of I think it's 52 countries at the moment, that used to belong to the British Empire. Nearly all of them used to belong to the Empire, and they still keep contact in kind of cultural, political, and economic ways. So this is called the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, or the Commonwealth of Nations, and as you can see, it covers much of the area that was the Shokuminchu Jidai no Kuni Daikai haiteru. Okay, you'll notice Minami Ayururando ga haite nai. Okay, we'll be talking about that a little bit later on because they had a particularly bad experience with the British. So this situation that we have today, the history of it goes back very much to the 18th century, all right, to our period. This was all kind of moving in this direction 200, 300 years ago. Now, before we go on, I'm not sure how much you know about Britain, okay, so let's just do a little bit of background stuff on somewhere I'm going to call the United Kingdom. The map that we've got up there at the moment, what does it show? What does that map show? I'm going to put the United Kingdom as a title, but it's not quite right. What does the map actually show? Anybody want to take a guess? Go on, take a risk. Yeah? No? Okay, anybody? Oh, 一緒に相談してください. Okay? See if your friend knows. Okay? What do you call that? What do you call that? No? Do you know what you call that? No? Want to take a guess? No? Anybody? No? No takers? Any idea? No? Anybody? No? 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 Okay. No? Oh, nobody over here. Is anybody over here going to take a risk? Sorry? Great Britain. Well, it is Great Britain, but it's something else as well. Because Great Britain would not be all of that red area. Okay? I mean, yes, Great Britain is shown there. If I said that part of this is Great Britain, which part would you choose? The big bit. Yeah? The big bit. All right? But not that smaller island to the left of it. Okay? That's not Great Britain. Okay? That's Ireland. So the big island is called Great Britain. Okay? Or just Britain. Great Britain to Great Britain, どっちでも使っていい。大体意味が同じ. Right? There's no big difference in the meaning of Britain and Great Britain. Basically, it's the same thing. Okay? So, the whole area of Great Britain and Ireland together is called the British Isles. Okay? It's not a political term. It just shows that area on the map. It's not about politics or, territory or this country or that country. Just that area on the map is the British Isles. All right? And it's divided into two big parts. Britain and Ireland. All right? So that's the first step. Because, in Japanese you've got igirisu, you've got eikoku, but you don't really have a clear understanding of what this area is. Because is Igirisu England? Is Igirisu Britain? Is Igirisu the United Kingdom? Same problem with eikoku. We're not really quite sure what area we're talking about in Nihongo de ittara, when we say it in Japanese. So, we've got these two basic pieces of land. Now this map is more political. It's dividing it up into 4 different countries. The names of those countries are... Okay? Can you name any of them? Sorry? Wales. Yeah, Wales. Which one would be Wales? Right, the grey one is... Okay, we got one. The grey one is Wales. The green one, the dark green one, is Scotland. The blue one's England, right, by a process of elimination. And Ireland is already marked because Ireland is the island and it's the country. Except it's... For a long, long time, the name of the island, Airuland, Shima to Kuni wa onaji deshita. So, yeah, basically then we've got Ireland is Ireland, England is this part, Wales is this part, and Scotland's this part. All right? So, Britain Britain and England really, before 1707, we mostly say England. ウェールズが入っていたけど、大体イギリス、England と言います。スコットランドは別でした。Okay, so then in 1707, Scotland and England joined together, and so then we start to say Britain. 島がすべて一つの国になっちゃう。So it becomes Britain. Okay, Wales have been under English control since the Chusei Jidai, since the Middle Ages. Okay. So that's really the beginning of the United Kingdom. England and Scotland unite. Wales was already together from before. So England and Scotland unite, Britain is united, and people talk about the United Kingdom of Great Britain, or the United Kingdom of Britain. Okay? And that's in the beginning of the 18th century. And then we get Ireland. Basically, yes, England controls Ireland at this time, but it's not united until 19世紀の初め, until 1801. And then it becomes the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. But 歴史と現代のことを両方説明したいので、please notice the second little area here, a more yellowy kind of green. Only this part is inside the United Kingdom. And Southern Ireland today is an independent country, 100年前ぐらいから。So we've got Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. So it is complicated, isn't it? I can say I'm English, okay, because I'm from the blue area. Okay, not from the green or grey, or okay, I'm from the blue area, so I'm English. I can say I'm British because I'm from the Okinashima. I'm British. I can say I'm from the United Kingdom. Okay, because I'm not from Minami Airurando de Wanaikara. I'm from that area, and I'm not from the south of Ireland. So I'm from the United Kingdom. So, それからその3つ言えます。I'm from the United Kingdom, I'm British, and I'm English. But somebody who's born in the dark green area would never say, I'm English. They would always say, I'm Scottish. ちょっと怒る。イングランド人と言われていたら。I'm not English, I'm Scottish. Okay? People would be very proud. Wales demo, don't go to Wales and tell people that they're English. Okay? Mukashi kara, they kind of look on the English as kind of techie. Okay? You can see that Mukashi kara wakete ita kuni deshita. There were different countries. And bunka to shakai wa to kotaba demo chigaimasu. They have a different culture, they have a different society, they even have a different language. Okay? This is because basically Scotland, Ireland, and Wales are Celtic countries. Okay? 4000年前ぐらいからケルト人がイギリスにいました。Okay? います。今でも。So for a long time, the Celtic people occupied the British Isles. And then 1500年前ぐらい, about 1,500 years ago, the Anglo-Saxon people came and controlled the part we call England. England was Anglo-Saxon land. Okay? ドイツから来ました。So my language, English, is ドイツ的な言葉。Okay? Mein Hus, my house. Okay? I don't know. Ich bin, I am. Is it be? Okay? Lots of things are very similar between German and English. Okay? ケルトの言葉、ずっと昔の言葉ですから、Celtic languages are much older and 全然関係ない。They're not similar to English. I think I've told you some of this before, some of you this I've said before in the last class if you were here, but I was in Wales for 1 year doing linguistics at university, and it was a part of Wales where the Welsh language was still very strong, and I could not learn Welsh, too difficult. But I did learn one thing. I learned how to ask for my beer in Welsh. Now, if I ask for my beer in English, I say a pint of bitter, please. I don't say a pint of beer because it's like saying, it's like going into a fruit shop and saying I'd like some fruit. So I'd like a pint of bitter, please, in English. I'd like a pint of bitter, please, in Welsh. It is not a whole-game of English. It's a moto furui kotoba. Okay? And it's still quite widely spoken in Wales. Scotland to Ireland, they have their own languages. 話す人は少なくなってるけど、they still have they have their own language, they have their own culture. So this is Britain. This is Britain today, and again, the history of uniting inside Britain to make these and Ireland inside the British Isles to make these 4 countries join together. All right, again, that's something that's happening in the 18th century. All right, so let's look outside the United Kingdom. Oh, since outside the United Kingdom, sorry, ちょっと混乱しました。Scotland and the United Kingdom. まだ話があります。So, during the 17th century, the family that controlled England was actually a Scottish family. Okay, this is Henry 8世の妹はスコットランドの王様と結婚しました。ずっと前。Okay, so when Queen Elizabeth died, the nearest relative was the nearest family was the King of Scotland. She had no children, so the Stuarts became kings of England, and they were Scottish. Now, the Scottish Stuarts had a very difficult time. One of them was so unpopular that they chopped his head off. They killed him. His son was okay, the first son. The second one, the brother, was forced to abdicate. I put it up a little note at the bottom of the page to explain abdicate. He had to stop being king. Okay, he was pushed out. The reason was because he became a Catholic, and his wife was also a Catholic, and she had a son. ちょっと難しい話ですけど、我慢してください。後でわかると思います。So he had a son, and when the son was born, people thought, oh, we have a Catholic king, okay, but he's quite old, he will die. And his 2 daughters, 前の結婚の2人の兄弟の 2 daughters, Musume, they are Protestants, so they'll be queen afterwards. But no, he has a son, and everybody thinks, oh my God, the son will become king, and he will have a Catholic king. Zutto will have Catholic kings in a Protestant country. And so this was not popular with the people, and so they pushed the king out. All right. And then there he is, look. Okay. And okay.
out. All right? You like that bit? I like that. I like that. It's from an English comedy it's from a comedy series called Monty Python, which was very famous when I was about your age. So he's pushed out. And so then the Protestant daughter, the oldest Protestant daughter, became the queen. And when she died, her husband was king. He was from Europe. He was king on his own. And then he died and her sister became queen. And then she died. Let's have a look at this. This is the guy that became a Catholic. Okay, his first wife, 2 daughters, Protestants. Second wife, she's a Catholic, he's a Catholic. They have a son, and the English people don't want, the British people don't want, or Scottish people, maybe many of them do, but the English people especially don't want him to be king when he dies. So they kick him out and she becomes the queen. All right, Mary. And then after Mary dies, her husband rules as king, then he dies, and then she dies, then no more family. So, the closest relative is him. So now the Scottish people who support him, many Scottish people support him, they fight against England. Okay? Well, in fact, he was not chosen as king. Her nearest relative, the nearest relative of these 2 sisters, was the king was from Germany. Again, because of this is what happens with princes and kings and queens. A prince has to marry a princess. So where do they find the princess? In another country. Okay, so kokusai kekkon was typical in the royal family. Okay, so the nearest shinseki was very often from another country. So the nearest relative, kareto igai, all right, because they didn't want him because he was a Catholic. They didn't want James. So they chose George from Germany. And the Scottish tried to make him James, to make him king. Okay, he was also called James, and he was called the Old Pretender. Pretend, today, again, I know ego, pretend means mane suru, but in those days it means yatte miteita. He was trying, osama ni natte mite. He was trying, he was pretending, trying. Okay, so pretend meant something more like try. He was trying to be the king. So he was the old pretender, the old person trying to be the king. Okay, so that rebellion in 1615, Shippai Shimashita, and James was not able to become king. And then again, the grandson, okay, James's son, also tried in 1645. So this was the second rebellion. And that also failed. And the grandson's name was Charles. He's called the Young Pretender, or Bonnie Prince Charlie. Bonnie in Scottish English means something like pretty or handsome. You can make up your own mind whether you think he's pretty or whether you think he's handsome. Okay, a bit of both, really, isn't it? So he tried to become king in 1745, and again he lost. And Scotland's dream died at that time. So this is a very big thing for the Scottish people. They still remember Bonnie Prince Charlie failing to become king, and the Scottish dream died when he lost the battle.
the Scottish bagpipes. Just give you a sound of Scotland. These are the English, of course, and the Scottish looking kind of wild. His expression especially, oh my God, we've lost. Okay, so moving on from there. Yeah, Scotland and its big dream of having a Scottish king, and the kind of lots of romantic stuff coming from Scotland about that. So quite a big topic. And on looking at ちょっと待って。すいません。これは違うじゃない。ちょっと待って。So you can't see them properly, but okay, Catholics couldn't marry Protestants. Catholics couldn't buy, the next one that's coming up is they couldn't buy a horse that cost more than £5. They could only buy a very bad horse. They can't teach, they can't run a school. All right, they can't buy land. Yeah, they can't have guns. I can't read that one. Sorry. They can't. Protestants may not become Catholics. If Protestants try to become Catholics, they can't. Catholics can't inherit Protestant land. Sorry, I'll change this section next time. They can't practice law. They can't practice law. They can't become lawyers. They're not allowed to. The last one at the bottom there. They're not allowed to go abroad to get an education. Okay, so they are victimized in their own country. All right, by the English. So the 18th century for Ireland is a very terrible time. One of the English families, not all the English people who went to Ireland were kind of Ijiwaru. One of them was a man called Jonathan Swift, very famous to you for Gulliver's Travels. Yeah, Gulliver's Travels. He wrote a speech for the Seijika, for the Parliament, saying, I have a very good idea to solve the problems in Ireland. The Irish people suffer terribly. They grow up and have a horrible life. Why? I have an answer to this. Instead of letting the Irish grow up and have a horrible life, why don't we just eat them when they're babies? That's what you, the Seijika, are doing to the Irish people. You've done everything to them. Why don't you just eat them when they're babies? And then they won't have to suffer all their lives. Okay? The very ironic attack, very famous attack by Swift on the, against the government for the bad treatment of the Irish people. So, but the government didn't listen. And the problems continued, and they'll continue into the 19th century, and even today. British Commonwealth Okay? Okay? Because of this bad history, this very bad experience that they had from the British. So, that's Scotland and Ireland. These laws were during a period that covers the whole of the 18th century, as you can see, from 1691 to 1801, and it was called the Protestant Ascendancy. And you've got thousands, hundreds of thousands, or tens of thousands at least, maybe hundreds of thousands of Irish people sent off as labourers.
So here's the British Empire around about 1800. Now those Irish people, were they sent as slaves? Some people argue, some historians say they were actually sent as slaves. Others disagree and say they were a kind of indentured servant, a small step up from being a slave. But there's no doubt, is there, about the Africans who were taken to America during the 17th century. They were slaves. There were about 11 million of them, and the British transported about 3 million. Okay? So let's look at that. This is, of course, the very famous slave triangle. The slave trade operated like this. Basically, Britain would export cheap goods, textiles like clothing, guns, alcohol, to this little, they only had a small area of Africa, but it was enough. Okay, they controlled this small area, and the people would go out and Arabic traders or African people or some white people would go out and find helpless individuals and force them into slavery. They would then be taken in boats, in ships across the Atlantic to the Caribbean and North America. And then the ship would be filled up with cotton, coffee, tobacco, okay, expensive goods. So it leaves England with very cheap goods and it comes back with very expensive goods. And people would make themselves very rich through this triangular trade. So the victims would be hunted, they would be captured, they'd be transported across the Atlantic Ocean, and they would be kept in terrible conditions. They would be abused and maltreated and then sold and become somebody's property. And all of that is going on in the 18th century. Okay. All right. This is the other side of the 18th century. Most of the slaves were sold to plantations in the Americas. You just see just some of the kinds of drawings. A lot of these drawings were made by people who were against the slave trade and wanted to, they didn't have photographs in those days, okay, so they would draw pictures, but this is what's happening, this is what they're doing, we must stop this, okay? So there was a strong movement to try and stop it, and of course it did in the early 19th century. Britain stopped the trade, and but this was basically what was going on all through the 18th century. It's one of the reasons why British people don't very much like the elite, quite often. How did they get so rich? Okay, the very rich families in Britain, some of them would have been become rich through this kind of business. All right, so again, history is with us today. The results of history are still alive. All right, those black people are still there in America, having problems with Trump, okay, and the Ku Klux Klan and everything. And the people who sold them, their families are still sitting in Britain and they're rich. Okay, so history is still with us. Okay, so talking about America then, the big thing that happens in the 18th century, that Britain loses control of America. This is the major loss of the British at this time. Mostly they were successful, but they lost America. Basically, the reason was that Britain wanted taxes from the American people, but the American people had no possibility to take part in the British government or to be part of the society. So why are you taxing us when we have no rights? Okay, we don't belong to your country. Why are you taxing us? And so the white Americans who were originally British were angry with Britain because of its taxation system. And so they went to war. And they won. Firstly, they protested against the tax, or one of the early things they did was protest against the tax by throwing a huge shipment of tea into the water, because they didn't want to pay the British tax on tea. Okay? Why can't we just get our tea straight from India? Why do we have to get it from you people and pay you a huge tax? Okay, it's not fair. So they were angry about it. And it's called the Boston Tea Party. You might have heard of it, it's very famous. And then it developed into a full-scale war, and then Britain lost its American colonies. Meanwhile, so I'm focusing here on the kind of American side of the western side of the British Empire, but the British Empire also extended into the east. In the east, it was a very different sort of situation. It was mostly trading, and the huge trading company, the East India Company, had been set up at the beginning of the 17th century, or the very end of the 16th century, depending on how you look at it, by Queen Elizabeth. And this company grew so powerful that basically India was controlled not by the British government in the 18th century, but by a British company. It was so powerful, this company, that it had its own army. The army of the East India Company was more than twice the size of the army of the government, the British government. So, kuri yori East India Company no hoga tsuyokatta. It was more powerful than the country itself. In the end, the government had to bring it under control in the 19th century. But in the 18th century, it was very much private enterprise and the East India Company. Frankly, there's never been a company like the East India Company. I mean, the Coca-Cola Company may have its outlets everywhere. There may be a McDonald's everywhere you go. They don't actually have their own army, do they? They don't go out there sort of shooting people. All right? This is an extraordinary thing, that back in the 18th century, there was this hugely powerful company that was controlling the whole of India and more territory. Again, chotto shittai shita mitai. Okay, so moving on to the end of the 18th century, you've got France in a total state of turmoil as the working classes rose up against the ruling elite. And basically, it was a bloodbath in the end when an entire social class, the elite of the country, was basically wiped out. And this led to a huge fear in Britain, of course, that something similar was going to happen there. So, although Britain was not directly involved in the French Revolution, it was very much influenced by it, and the fear that something similar might happen in Britain lay at the heart of the governmental policies of the time, and also influenced British politics during the following century, during the 19th century as well. All right, so I'm going to finish up with talking about the ordinary people and the effect that all this fighting and empire building had on them. Obviously, the government and the rich, the privileged classes, had something to gain by it, but the poorer people basically were simply the labour that would be available to make it possible for these things to happen. They were the labour force, they were the ones who had to work the fields, they built the ships, they fought the wars, and as the 18th century developed and the Industrial Revolution got underway, they were the ones who had to dig the coal out of the ground, they were the ones who had to work in the factories and so on. Well, I'll be coming back to their lives later on in the course. For now, what I want to do is just take a look at just one simple aspect, one particular thing that was going on in the 18th century, the so-called press gang, which was a system for forcing people, particularly into the navy, also sometimes into the army, forcing people to join and work pretty much against their will. It wasn't easy to find people to support the government and to support the companies, the East India Company and people like this, in their very violent methods of developing the markets and so on. So this particular method came into being at the time. The method was very simply just to go out onto the streets and force young men into the navy in particular, sometimes into the army, in this sort of way. All right? The people with sticks are basically saying, you can come and join the navy, or you can get beaten up by us. We'll simply just use the sticks on you and knock you to the ground if you don't come with us. So they had pretty much no choice. And once they got into the navy, the conditions were extremely harsh. The discipline was very strict. Punishments were so severe that people would people would sometimes not survive. And one of the ways of keeping the sailors in service was to pay their wages 6 months after they had earned them. So they would get wages up until 6 months before. In that way, if they ran away, then they wouldn't get the last 6 months of their pay. Even that wasn't enough to keep quite a lot of people. Quite a lot of people ran away and deserted because the conditions were so hard. So while the elite members of society were making fortunes, the common people were having a hard time. And that's probably something that lies very much at the heart of the 18th century: social inequality, injustice, and it's one of the themes that we'll be developing in the following classes. Okay, I'm sorry that the PowerPoint presentation was a little bit iffy this morning. I didn't have a chance, as you know, to give it its final check before I began the class, but I think we managed to get the main points across. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again next week.